Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. We're having a webinar this morning of 1 hour, presenting you the common checklist of the European Commission as consultants and the different ESOs. You are all muted, so you will not be able to speak out loud, but please be informed that we have, as usual, the Q&A panel for you available for submitting your questions. So if you have a question, please don't hesitate to submit your question, and the speakers will take a moment to answer your question. Should you be on Twitter, you can tweet about us. I think the next slide can be shown already, and even the next one, because there it is showing you the Q&A panel and the possibility to tweet about the topic should you be on Twitter with the hashtag training for standards. And SEN and SENELEC are available on Twitter at standards for EU. So I think on the next slide, I can already go ahead and present the speakers of today. My colleagues Frédéric and Nuno are connected as well to present to you the common checklist. So please, guys, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar dedicated to the new common checklist. So this is the agenda for today's webinar. So we will start with the purpose of the checklist. Then we will do a quick reminder of the original checklist for harmonized standards, and then we will tackle the new ESOs common checklist. So following an increase of lack of compliant assessments at formal votes and before publication stages, BT decided to create a specific work group to analyze the situation and come with recommendations. This analysis showed that one of the main reasons for lack of compliance was linked to issues with SEN and SENELEC internal regulations part 3. BT considered it necessary to increase support to technical bodies to help them to better understand the aspects to be considered when drafting harmonized standards, and to achieve compliant HAS assessment reports. Therefore, the checklist for drafting harmonized standard was created and introduced in 2021. The aim is to improve compliance of draft standards submitted for HAS assessment, thereby reducing time needed for their development and increasing overall efficiencies for the technical bodies. The checklist for harmonized standard was again introduced in 2021 and mandatory for homegrown projects as of October 2021. The checklist deals with horizontal aspects covering all sectors except construction. Given the peculiarity of this sector, a modified version of this checklist was developed. The technical committee secretary in SEN and technical body secretary or reporting secretariat in SENELEC are responsible for ensuring that the checklist is filled out and submitted to CCMC with the draft candidate harmonized standards and their supporting document justifications. The checklist is mandatory for homegrown standards, harmonized standards, but the use of the checklist is still strongly recommended for harmonized standards under Vienna and Frankfurt agreements, as it will help identify critical elements that could potentially lead to a lack of compliance assessment. So this is the actual checklist for harmonized standard that is available on the SEN and SENELEC bots. Now,
Sorry, Frédéric, but people are asking if you can speak a bit louder or closer to the microphone. Okay. I can hear you well, but apparently audio is not the best. Sorry.
Thank you. I'll try to speak very close to the microphone then. So about the new ESOs common checklist. So considering the previous BT decisions approving the checklist for harmonized standards and the recommendations from the ESOs task force, BT approved the new ici ESOs common checklist that is common to the ESO, so SENELEC NNC, the HAS consultant and the EC officers. The goal being to further improve alignment between standard drafters and HAS consultants and the European Commission. For the technical body and technical committees to have a transition period, kind of a transition period between the checklist for harmonized standard and the new common checklist. The new common checklist is optional as of next week, so July 1st, next week Friday, and mandatory as of October 1st. Like the previous checklist for harmonized standard, the new common checklist is mandatory for homegrown draft harmonized standard and still strongly recommended for draft harmonized standard under Frankfurt and Vienna agreements. You can have access to the checklist by following the links on the SEN and SENELEC both pages. The new checklist should be available as of today on the BOSS. So this is the process for submitting a document for assessment for the SEN side. So the work group drafts the harmonized standard. The work group qualified support checks that the draft harmonized standard fulfills the requirement of the directive. The work group qualified support ensures as well that the checklist is filled out. And then the work group qualified support or the work group convener submits to the TC secretary the draft harmonized standard, the checklist, the new common checklist filled out, and if relevant, for example, if there was an assessment at the previous stage, the table of comments from the assessment filled out by the work. Then the TC secretary checks that the checklist is filled out and submits the draft and the checklist and all the needed elements to CCMC for the request of the assessment. During the in-check, it is checked that the checklist is submitted together with the elements needed for the assessment. If the checklist is submitted, then the procedure for inquiry or formal vote could start. If the checklist is not submitted, then the project will be rejected and the technical body will have to come back to resubmit the elements together with the checklist. On the SENELEC side, the process is similar. So the work group drafts the harmonized standard and the work group ensures that the following documents are submitted to the TC secretary. So the draft harmonized standard, the checklist filled out, and same thing, if there was an assessment at previous stage, that the commenting table from the HAS assessment report is filled out. Then the checklist together with all the needed elements, draft harmonized standard and so on, are submitted by the TC secretary to CCMC. Same thing, during the in-check, it is checked that the checklist is submitted together with the elements. If the checklist is submitted, then the procedure can start. If the checklist is not submitted, then the project will be rejected and the technical committee will have to come back with all the needed elements. So now we will move to the new common checklist and we will explain how it looks like and what are the main differences. So this is the new common checklist, and the scope here mentions that the checklist is the basis for ESOs and their technical bodies for self-assessment of harmonized standards. As explained earlier, the SEN and SENELEC standards deliverables shall follow the provisions of SEN and SENELEC internal regulations part 3. This new common checklist is divided in 3 parts. The part A includes criteria that are specifically for the ESOs. Part B3 includes common criteria for the European Commission, the HAS consultant, and the ESOs. And the part C is specifically for the HAS consultant. The ESOs, so SEN and SReq in our case, need to complete parts A and B3 when carrying out a self-assessment. The part B of the checklist covers the same content as in the HAS assessment report used by the HAS consultant when carrying out an assessment. And so, as I said earlier, the checklist is applicable for all SEN and SReq sectors except constructions where the dedicated checklist has to be used. I will now give the floor to Nuno Pargana, who will further discuss about this common checklist.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear us a little bit better now. So here we have the part A. As my colleague Frederick said, the part A is the criteria that is only applicable to SEN and SReq. So this means that the HAS consultant will not be filling this part A on the checklist. The first information that you need to fill is generic or general information about your project. So you need to indicate here the reference of your standards, the reference of the work item, the stage. So if you are talking about a first working draft, an inquiry, a formal vote, you need to list as well the legislation applicable. And in case of multiple legislation, then you need to list all of them here. In terms of standardization requests, you have also to indicate the reference of the standardization request or the mandate. And similarly to that, what I just explained earlier, in case of multiple mandates or standardization requests, you need to list them as well in this field. Then you need to indicate the reference to the technical body, and you need, in the field below, you need to explain whether you are drafting a standard that is a homegrown standard, or if it's a standard that is developed in parallel with ISO or IEC. So you just need to tick those boxes over here. Now we move to the part that is about the criteria that is only applicable to SEN and SReq technical bodies. So as I said, the HAS consultant will not look at this criteria. This is a 3-column table where in the first column you have all the criteria listed. In the second column, you have the compliance check with the different possibilities of assessment against each of the criteria. So fulfilled, not fulfilled, or not applicable. And then the last column of this table is to provide, it's a field for you to provide comments or justifications for each of these criteria when relevant. So very exceptional. If something is not fulfilled or not applicable, you are, of course, then invited to submit a comment here to explain why. So let's go point by point. 1.1.1 basically is that you need to ensure that your draft standard is listed in a standardization request and or covered by a mandate supporting EU legislation. So mandates are flexible and don't have the list of standards there, but in the last standardization requests, normally in the Annex 1, you have the list of standards, and you need to ensure that the standard, the harmonized standard that you are preparing is listed in this Annex 1. The other thing you need to do as well is just to ensure that the information that is available on Projects Online database is correct. So you just need to ensure that in your projects on Projects Online, the information is correctly linked with the EU legislation, with the standardization request. This information comes from the new work item proposal form from your side. And if there is something wrong, if there is a wrong link or no link at all, you just need to contact CCMC, and then we will help you and we will ensure that the correct information then is displayed on Project Online. And why is this information? Well, we want to avoid the situation that accidentally we don't request any assessment for inquiry or formal vote because the information is missing. So we need this information also to tell CCMC that we are dealing with an harmonized standard and we need to request an assessment. So 1.1.2, so the working group needs to answer all the comments from the previous assessment at the previous stage of the HAS consultant. So normally you have a table of comments from the HAS consultant, and in the last column, observations of the secretariat, you need to indicate how you are addressing the comments from the HAS consultant. This table can be very important for the consultant at a later stage when he or she is assessing the standard to really understand how you are addressing the comments that he or she provided. For obvious reasons, if you are filling the checklist for requesting a first working draft, in this case, there is no previous assessment and you would need to reply not applicable. If you are at formal vote stage, obviously there was a previous inquiry assessment, and in this case, you need to ensure that you address the comments of the consultant at inquiry stage. The criterion 1.1.3 is about the forward of the standard. So in case you are preparing a revision of an harmonized standard, you need to ensure that you highlight in the forward the significant changes compared to the previous version. So this is nothing new. This is actually something covered already. It's a rule according to SEN and SENELEC internal regulations part 3. And of course, if you are dealing with a brand new standard, then of course this requirement will not be applicable because you are not dealing with a revision. 1.1.4 is still about the forward of the standard. Each harmonized standard needs to include in the forward these two sentences that you can see here to indicate that the standard has been prepared under a standardization request and that there is the Annex Z that makes the relationship between the standard and the EU legislation. The only thing you need to do basically when you are drafting your standards is to do a copy paste of this text in your forward. But of course, in this section where it says the relevant ESO, you need to indicate SEN, SENELEC, and or SEN and SENELEC. So depending on where you are, in which situation you are. Where you see Annex Z, of course, here you would need to put Annex ZA in the case of SEN and Annex ZZ in the case of SENELEC. And these texts have been, just for your information, this text has been agreed between the Commission, EFTA, and SEN and SENELEC. The next one is 1.1.5. It's still about, it's about normative references. So if you list the standard in the clause 2 of the standard, which is normative references, you need to ensure that this standard is normatively referenced in the text. So if you look at the clause of the standard where this reference is being referenced, you need to ensure that the clause is drafted as a requirement. So normally you would see typically a shall to that. If this is not happening, so if you have something listed in clause 2 that is not written as a requirement in the text of the standard, you need to either remove it from the clause 2, or you need to keep it in the clause 2, and you draft the you draft the clause as a requirement. So the criterion 1.1.6 is about still normative references. SEN and SENELEC technical boards last year approved a guidance document on the use of normative references in harmonized standards. This document was developed in close collaboration with the European Commission, who agreed with the document. It's available today on the SEN and SENELEC BOSS pages. And basically, this document provides recommendations, good practice examples, requirements that you need to follow in order to comply with the requirements for citation of the European Commission. So it's really important that you follow this guidance document, and then if you apply all those principles in the guidance document, you can indicate here that you have fulfilled these criteria. 1.1.7 is about something else. So obviously, you will draft clauses of your standard with requirements that are linked with essential requirements of EU legislation. Those clauses need to be, let's say, included in the Annex Z. However, you may as well include requirements that are not linked with essential requirements of EU legislation. This is possible. However, you just need to ensure that these clauses containing these requirements, not giving presumption of conformity, are included in a completely separate clauses of your standard. So you cannot mix these clauses together with clauses that give presumption of conformity. And you need to ensure that these clauses with requirements not giving presumption of conformity are not included in the Annex Z. 1.1.8 is about standardization requests and mandates. So the recent standardization requests, you can see normally in the Annex 2, some requirements that need to be addressed in the standards. Normally mandates, from my experience, except for construction, normally mandates don't have these requirements, but recent standardization requests have requirements in the Annex 2 or other annexes. And during the drafting of your standard, you really need to ensure that those requirements in the standardization request are also addressed in the standard. So when you draft your standard, it's not sufficient that you just look at the EU legislation applicable for you, but you need to look as well at the requirements of the standardization request. Then the criteria 1.1.9, 1.1.10, and 1.1.11 is about the Annex Z. So you just need to ensure that the templates for the Annex Z are used. So you should not modify the template. You just need to fill with the information that is required. And the templates, of course, are available on SEN and SEN-alike BOSS. If you spot any issue with the templates, just let us know, and we will support you with that. In case your harmonized standard is covering multiple legislation, then you will need multiple Annex Z, one per EU legislation. And 1.1.11, basically, the Annex Z will indicate what are the legal requirements that are claimed to be covered, and this needs to be clearly linked with a clause or a subclause of the standard. So what is really important also is that in your Annex Z, you do not make reference directly to standards. So you need to only make reference to clauses of your harmonized standard, and those clauses then link with essential requirements of the legislation. So we move to the part B. So the part B1 is here, but is only to be filled by the HAS consultant. So this is something that the technical bodies do not need to complete. The part B1 is a summary of the assessment to be done by the consultant. The part B2 is basically the conclusion of the assessment by the consultant. So basically is the outcome of the assessment. So after the consultant goes through the criteria and the requirements, we'll have to indicate whether the assessment is compliant, conditional compliant, or lack of compliance. So you might be tempted to mark compliance here, but this section is not for you to fill, it's just for the consultant. Now, the section B3 is the section that you need to complete, and the requirements and criteria listed here are exactly the same requirements that the consultants will use when they are assessing the standards for compliance with EU legislation and the standardization request. So at a certain point, we have received multiple comments from stakeholders, from our technical boards, that there are too many checklists, too many requirements. There was a SEN-alike checklist, there was a HAS assessment report, there was the Commission also checklist. So the idea is really to have one common checklist. We all will look at the same requirements when we are doing the self-assessment from the side of the technical bodies, or when the consultant is doing their own assessment during the development process of the standard. So on the first column, you have the criteria that is common for SEN and SEN-alike, but also the consultants. The second column, you have the compliance check. So this is exactly the same as for the part A. You have seen this. The third column is rather for the HAS consultant. So in case something is not fulfilled, not compliant, the consultant will need to indicate here which clause of the standard or subclause this issue is not compliant. Then in the fourth column is rather for the consultant, not for you to fill, is for the consultant to provide their comments and justifications. And the last column, of course, similarly to what you just saw in the part A, is for you to provide any comment, any justification you might want to provide for each of the requirements. So let's go through the common criteria. So the first one is about terminology. So the terminology that you will use in your harmonized standard needs to be aligned or consistent with the terminology or definitions used in the EU legislation. 1.2.2 is about the forewords and the introduction. So you need to ensure that these elements of the standard includes appropriate information. So you cannot have their requirements, recommendations. You cannot have their, for example, legal interpretations of the EU legislation. And of course, the elements that I just explained before on the forward also needs to take into account. 1.2.3, we start with the requirements on the scope of the standard. So your standard, when you are preparing it, needs to cover in the scope products, services, or aspects that are also covered by the relevant EU legislation and the relevant standardization request. 1.2.4, the scope cannot set requirements. This is again nothing new, because looking at SReq internal regulations part 3, you cannot set requirements or recommendations in the scope. 1.2.5, so of course your standard will cover products or services that are covered by the legislation, but your standard may also cover products or aspects that are not covered by the EU legislation. This is possible, but you need to be very clear when you write that in your standard, so to ensure that this is written in a way that is separated from those products and clauses that give presumption of conformity. 1.2.6, so the standard really needs to specify the intended uses and the application. So from my experience, this is normally happening in the scope of the standard. And the last requirement on the scope is that you need to ensure, so this is 1.2.7, you need to ensure that the scope, the title, and the annex that they are aligned and they are consistent with each other. So this is quite important as well. So now we move to the normative references criteria, which is quite important. One, because it's one of the main reasons leading to lack of compliance assessment. One of the important points that you need to always be aware when you draft your harmonized standard is there, when you are writing a clause, you need to ask yourself the question whether that clause gives presumption of conformity or not. And if you want to include a normative reference in that clause, if the clause gives presumption of conformity, then you need to apply not only the internal regulations part 3 rules, but you need to apply the criteria that are listed here and the criteria that are listed in the SReq guidance document on normative references. If the clause does not give presumption of conformity, nothing related to the requirements of EU legislation, then you can include normative references just complying with IR3, and you do not have to follow these criteria, let's say. So let's assume that the clause gives presumption of conformity. So your normative references need to be published at the moment that your harmonized standard is published. So you cannot have draft normative references at the moment of the publication of your harmonized standard. Your normative references need to be dated. Your chain of normative references need to be coherent and limited and published. So this is something that whenever possible, when you make a reference to a normative reference, try as well to define a specific clause, because by doing that, you are really limiting the chain, or you are closing the chain, basically. 1.2.11, so your normative references need to be state-of-the-art, and they cannot be withdrawn documents or outdated documents at the moment of publication of your standard. And 1.2.12, basically, if we are dealing with a clause giving presumption of conformity, and you want to make a reference to a standard that is independently applicable or covering risks, products, or services that have nothing to do with the essential requirements of the EU legislation, then this reference needs to be informative and not normative. 1.2.13, so basically is just to indicate that the content of your standard cannot conflict with the articles and the content of the EU legislation. 1.2.14 is just to ensure that the requirements in your standard are written really in a clear way and that there is no room for arbitrary choices. So you should not have requirements with different possibilities where the user of the standard would choose the most convenient for him or her to give presumption of conformity. So this is the goal of these criterion, let's say. 1.2.15 is to ensure that you don't do legal interpretations of, let's say, the EU legislation or the standardization request in your standard. 1.2.16 is to ensure that you don't do copy-paste of EU legislation directly in your standard unless is absolutely needed. And that's why the word unsuitable is here. So the document does not unsuitably repeat legal requirements, because it could happen that in some situations, I can give an example, like there is a standardization request for space heating appliances, and there are thresholds of emissions there that need to be included in the standard. So in this case, we will have to repeat requirements, but in general, you cannot. And if you are in those exceptional cases, then it's better that you provide a justification to explain why you are doing that. 1.2.17 is about the drafting of requirements. So you need to ensure that the requirements are verifiable and they are measurable. And we have organized a webinar last year in November, and I would invite you then to follow that webinar to better understand how the requirements should be drafted. 1.2.18 and 1.2.19 is about the neutrality principle. So you need to ensure that you write the standards in a way that they do not impose requirements or obligations to different economic operators. So this is something for you to have in mind. 1.2.20, so in some cases, for some sectors, you may need to produce a risk assessment, or you need to identify the relevant risks. If your sector do not have these needs to produce the risk assessment, then of course you would just mark as not applicable. If that's the case, if you produce such document and then you conclude that some risks, relevant risks, will not be covered in the standard, you will need to indicate that in the Annex Z. 1.2.21 and 1.2.22 is about its additional requirements on the Annex Z. And basically what you need to do is really to ensure that your Annex Z is very granular, very specific, and that the clauses of the standard included in the Annex Z are really matching the essential requirements of the EU legislation. So if you put in the Annex Z a requirement, sorry, the essential requirement on, let's imagine, ergonomics, you need to ensure that the clause that you are mentioning in the standard is not about noise. So this is quite straightforward, but it's always important to do a double check of the content of the Annex Z. Then 1.2.23 is about the potential needs to align your standard also with available sectoral guidance documentation or sectoral checklists. But it's very important that these guidance documents and these checklists are agreed with the European Commission. So if they are not agreed, it is better that to discuss with the Commission, try to have a common approach, and then you can, and then the consultants also know that there are these guidance documents, these checklists, sectoral checklists to be fulfilled as well. And then we are about to finish the checklist. 1.2.24 and 1.2.25 is for those cases that you are dealing with the revision. And in case in your revision, you are covering less risks from the previous standard. If you do that, then you need either to provide a justification, and the justification would be written here in this comment box on the right side, or you need to indicate in the Annex set which risks are not covered. 1.2.26 is about avoiding reproducing personal data. So this is something that the Commission found some issues with that in some standards. So they asked to include these requirements. And then 1.2.27, other findings. So here you don't have an assessment, a compliance check result here. You can use this section if you want to provide any sort of comments that could be in addition to those requirements, or any new requirement that is not covered here, but you think you would like to share that information, you can do it here. I believe that these will be mostly used by the consultants in the fourth column, where they may add additional information. And the part C, it's a part that is not for you. So it's here just because it's a common checklist, but for you to know that the consultant will also look at these elements and will fill the section according to the availability of certain documents or information. So now I will pass the word to Frederick, who will then just continue the webinar.
Thank you, Nuno. So I will take back the screen, and I will share the presentation again. Yeah, so now it's the Q&A time. So we have tried to answer quite some questions already in the Q&A. We have still quite some questions to answer.
Yes, so I can take the first one. There is a comment or a question whether the common checklist is also applicable for harmonized standards in support of the construction products regulation. So the answer is no. In the heading of the checklist, you can see that this common checklist applies to all sectors except for the construction sector. Harmonized standards in support of the CPR are not really following the NLF approach, and for the construction sector, we are working on a specific checklist that will be slightly modified from this common checklist. But of course, we will have to work together with the construction unit, with the standardization unit at the Commission, and also internally with our technical board members, permanent delegates, to ensure that this checklist is also feasible. So we are working on it. For the time being, this common checklist is applicable to all sectors, except for the construction sector. Now there is a question from Andreas asking whether the Commission accepted that this is a complete checklist and is still mandatory, but not necessarily sufficient. Well, this checklist is, well, first of all, it should be considered a living document. The checklist is stable for now and includes most of the criteria that needs to be fulfilled. But of course, if there is something that is not really tackled in the checklist and spotted by the consultants, then, or by you, then it means that you should align the standard to this additional comment that is not really tackled in the checklist. And this could mean that in the future, the checklist could be slightly revised to include some additional criteria.
I will answer a question from Aline Vecchia about the use of normative references. So the question is it still permitted to refer to a project, provided it will be published when the project is published? So yes, it is possible. And by the way, this is part of the new outcome conditional compliance, sorry. So you can just fill in the checklist as you checked the normative references. And of course, you have to be sure that the normative reference you use will be available when your reference is published.
I will answer now a question from Bernd Bolzer. Basically, there is a mistake in the 1.1.7 checklist field that cannot be filled. At first, I did not understand the question. And then when I went to the checklist and I tried to mark fulfilled, not applicable, I realized that indeed there is a mistake, and we will ensure that these boxes can be filled. Thank you, Bernd, for spotting this.
I will take a question about it says the presentation says that the work group will fill out the checklist, but the list itself says that the TC does it. As I said in the presentation, it's either the work group convener who fills in the checklist or the TC secretary, but at the end, the TC secretary should check that the checklist is filled in before submitting the elements to SEN and SReq for the assessment request.
There is a question from Andreas Oost again about the construction. Well, I work also in the construction sector, so it's quite easy for me to answer those. But the question is 1.1.10 is about the possibility in some cases to have multiple EU legislation. And the question is about harmonized standards in support of the CPR. And the question is whether there could be multiple regulations, and I assume that you are referring to the CPR and the machinery directive, or very soon machinery regulation. So yeah, the Commission actually is really, I think it's possible to have two Annex Zs, but in this specific case for construction, and because construction standards are really drafted as performance-based and standards in support of the machinery directive will be drafted with safety requirements in a completely different way. I kind of confirm what you said, that probably the best way would be to draft, in this specific case, two separate standards covering different things, one for the CPR and the other one for the machinery directive. That would be my suggestion also for the technical bodies.
I will answer a question from Sébastien Hout. Will this checklist be shared for comments with all relevant TCs before mandatory application? No, it will not be shared, as this new common checklist has been approved by BT. But just to complement, sorry, as Nuno was saying, this is a living document and it will be probably improved and it will evolve over time.
Exactly. So I think when you are using the checklist, if you notice that there are some things that don't make sense, or you want to make proposals to improve the checklist, please send it to us. We will gather those and then we will discuss with the European Commission in order to improve the checklist. Of course, for the time being, we need a little bit stability with the checklist. We are just implementing it. The HAS consultants will also have to start using this checklist, and I guess the Commission and Ernst & Young will need to provide training to them. But for the time being, this is a checklist, but we can always improve it based on your suggestions as well in the future. There is a comment from Sébastien Haute saying that 1.2.6 is wrong because for EMC directive, this is not to the standard to define the intended use of the product. So that's fine. So if something, so we try to have a global checklist that applies to all sectors. There are two options for in your case. One of the options is that if this requirement is not applicable for your sector, then you just mark not applicable, and then you can write a comment. Another possibility that you have is to prepare specific criteria for EMC that then can be complemented in these by this checklist. So you could also develop together with the relevant, let's say, stakeholders, the relevant groups, sector-specific criteria for EMC to be agreed with the European Commission, and then it could be included in this checklist as specific EMC requirements at the end of the checklist. There is a comment from Thomas Schreiber. I'm sorry if I'm making mistakes with the name of the experts here. Please be clear who has to fill in which part of the checklist. So, well, basically, in the introduction of the checklist, we indicate that the part A, B3 are to be filled by the technical bodies, and the rest is to be filled by the HAS consultant. So the only part that needs to be filled by the technical bodies is that part A and the part B3. We can also check after this meeting if there is something, some fine-tuning from an editorial point of view, just to highlight the parts to be filled by the technical body. So that is to avoid some confusion. So there is a comment from, or a question from Roger Stark about, I'm assuming that this comment is related to the machinery sector, where there are a lot of standards that are developed as a multi-part series, where the part one contains general requirements, and then the other parts basically use the part one as to complement their specific parts. So this general checklist is not really specifically for these multi-part series, but you need to use the checklist as well, the best you can. You need to provide those justifications then at the end when applicable and when needed. And for these multi-part, there is a specific guidance document that was agreed with the European Commission. And this is something that you would need to highlight at the end of your checklist if there were specific sectoral guidance documents or checklists used. And then, for example, in this case, for the machinery sector, there is instructions document on the multi-part series that you need to address those requirements in your standard. So again, the checklist is very horizontal. We could not tackle everything in detail, all the cases, but there is already a separate instructions for multi-part series. So there is a question from Dominic Wittmer, if there is a specific timeline for the development of the checklist for the machinery, for the construction sector. So here, by the way, we are presenting a webinar next week for the construction sector, where we will rather focus on this development of standardization requests. We will briefly talk about the tools that the construction sector or construction TCs will have to develop harmonized standards. One of the tools will obviously be the checklist, but it's difficult to know when this checklist will be available. We will work on the checklist and will be presented somewhere after the summer to the specific group that we have internally of our technical board. Yes, as soon as we have this checklist ready, as soon as we have also the guide 36 ready, we will provide, our intention is to provide another webinar focused on the construction sector for construction TCs.
I will take a question from Paul Dixon about the part B3. He's asking if the part B3 must be completed at submission, or if this is only to be completed after the HAS consultant. No, the part B3 has to be completed at the submission of the checklist.
There is a question from Anthony Breen. So the question is, what happens if there is no HAS consultant? So if you're dealing with a standard that is under a mandate or a standardization request in support of EU legislation, in view of being cited in the official journal, then it means that you just need to fill the checklist yourself. Then probably the standard will not be assessed by the HAS consultant, potentially could be assessed by some EC desk officer if he or she is available to do that. But it's quite important that you fill the checklist, because if you are in this situation of an harmonized standard to be offered and to be cited, the Commission will assess the standard. So it is quite important that you do your self-assessment in order to increase the chances of having your standard cited in the official journal, even if there is no HAS consultant. So if you need support in that case, Antonio, you can also get back to CCMC, and we can also try to see if we can help you in this period that you don't have, or in this situation where you don't have HAS consultants. There is a comment quite long and relevant from Hendricks about normative references that it can, so it's about the requirement 1.2.11, which is about withdrawn normative references or outdated normative references. Yes, it is true that sometimes the normative references are being developed by another TC or by the same TC, but in a different working group. And sometimes it might be difficult to really synchronize the development of your harmonized standard, the development of the normative reference. So here you have multiple options. One of the options is that you would wait, you try to delay a little bit the work of the harmonized standards, so the work on the normative reference can be speed up, so that you submit the standards more or less as a package at the same time for inquiry or formal vote. Another possibility is that, of course, you go ahead with your harmonized standard, and then maybe you will need to correct the normative reference after the standard, after the formal vote, or after the standard is published. There is a BT procedure that allows to make these corrections. One thing is for sure: if we offer a standard to the Commission assesses the standard, and there is an outdated normative reference, this document will not be cited in the official journal. So that's why in those cases, it's better to really try to synchronize as much as possible. If this is not possible, in the worst case scenario, there is a possibility, a procedure, a fast track procedure via the technical board to update the normative references and to include the correct date of normative references. And then we could offer it very quickly to the European Commission. Yeah, I see a comment from Sebastian Haute saying that there are too many subjective criteria: precise, appropriate, clear. Yes, we understand that maybe it's not, maybe it can be considered subjective in the checklist as such. What you need to ensure is that in the draft standard, then the requirements that you draft are really verifiable and measurable and precise. Let's put it this way. I know it's some of these topics can be subjective and different. That could happen that there are different interpretations from the technical body, the HAS consultant. But the most important is that you try really to draft the standards with clear requirements. So the requirements that are measurable. So for instance, if you write in your standard, the test shall be completed often. What does it often means? Is it often can mean different things for different users of the standard. So I understand your point, but the most important at the end is that we are very precise with the text in the standard, that things are very clear with the requirements. So in the there's a comment or a question, sorry, from David Goss. Is the second column in B3 for the TC or the consultant to complete? So you need to complete yourself this part, and then later on, the consultant, when they perform their assessment, the template for them will be empty. So they will use the template empty. In your case, is really to read the requirement, ensure that the requirement is addressed in the standard. And once this is done, you need to go to the checklist and tick the box fulfilled, not fulfilled, or not applicable. So the second column is for you to use as well.
And I will take the opportunity to answer as well a question from Paul Dixon about this part B3. So indeed, during your self-assessment, you should check the boxes on the part B3 to check that you have checked all the information there. And for the comments, then yes, you have to fill this part when you will receive the assessment report from the center. But again, this is the comment checklist that will be used as well as consultants when delivering the assessment report. So then once you have the assessment report, you can fill in the comments part on this part B3.
So there is I'm not sure I understood a comment, or sorry, a question from Inga Troster. Is the sentence in 1.1.4 different from the former one? Ah, yes, okay, I understand. So yes, the sentence is different from the former one. We have, based on some comments from EFTA, the sentence was modified. So you need to change that and start using this new sentence. We will also going to change our templates, the SEN and SENELEC forward templates. We're going to change it. We can somehow mention somewhere, I don't know where these main changes, what are the main changes, but we can maybe can submit it to you, Inga, if needed, so you can understand what are the changes compared to the previous sentence. And I explained that there was a request from EFTA to change this, and there was some discussion with the Commission, and this is the outcome of the discussion.
I will take a comment from Louis Christman. So I answer the question about how SENELEC TC could change the IEC text to adapt to European needs, and I suggested that European common modifications could be the solution for that. And there was a comment saying that saying no, because this will require to copy and modify the complete IEC standard. It's not completely correct, because again, the European amendment can amend only the parts that need to be adapted to the European needs and to the European legislation. And you don't have to copy and paste and modify all the complete IEC standard. It could be, for example, only a subclause of clause 3 that needs to be modified to address European needs.
I think it's 11 o'clock, and
yes, I just wanted indeed to suggest that we close down, but before we close down, we have still a feedback poll for our attendees. So I would like to launch it and ask people to reply to the 3 questions that we have, and that we the answers will be used, of course, for improving our webinars in the future. So I think we do realize that there's still some questions left unreplied, but as usual, we intend to make a Q&A report available via our website. So today still, I will take some time to provide you with the presentation and the recording of this webinar, and then afterwards the Q&A will be also put online. So thank you very much, Nuno and Frederic, for having answered already more than 30 questions. I would like to keep 1 more minute open to give people some time to reply to our poll. On the very last slide, I think there is still some information on our upcoming webinars. So as mentioned already, there is a webinar on the harmonized standards under CPR that is happening on the 29th, and then some other webinars also in the upcoming weeks. So feel free, if the topic is of your interest, to register via the hyperlinks that you will be receiving in the presentation later today. So thank you very much, Nuno. Thank you, Frederic. I don't know if you would like to add something.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good day. And bye-bye.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.